She went to the clinic to fix a small, practical thing, an exam she'd been putting off for months, and left convinced she'd made everything worse. The waiting room smelled of lemon disinfectant and frozen coffee. Sophie Bennett's fingers kept finding the edge of the clipboard on her lap, then sliding away, then returning as if touch could steady her. Her nails were raw from nervous chewing. The drab magazine covers blurred into a wash of glossy colors she couldn't focus on. The intake form asked for a lot of innocuous things: address, phone number, emergency contact. When it asked about current stressors, Sophie had written, in a cramped hand, work, money, anxiety. She almost crossed it out. It read like a confession. She felt ridiculous for letting a paper make her feel seen. The door to the exam room swung open, and a tall man in a white coat stepped into the light, the kind of light that made edges look dangerous and beautiful at once. He had a tidy haircut, the kind that never looked like it needed adjusting, and eyes that measured people with quick kindness instead of judgment. For a second, Sophie couldn't remember if she'd been exhaling. "Miss Bennett?" His voice was soft but clear, professional, not perfumed with the practiced charm she'd seen on television. He introduced himself, Dr. Daniel Hayes, and offered a hand he kept close to his side during the intake, a small, deliberate thing to avoid contact unless necessary. He read the form with an unhurried attention that made her feel less like a file and more like the person who had filled it out. It should have calmed her. Instead, her stomach pitched. The appointment began with that sterile choreography, questions about cycles, about headaches, about irregular sleep. Sophie answered in small, careful sentences. She told him what she knew and omitted what felt shameful, how she'd skipped a month of rent because the hours at the bookstore had been chopped, how a single social media post from a college classmate showing a new life in a different city made her chest ache. She tried to keep her voice level. The room hummed with fluorescent light and the faint rhythm of distant elevators. He explained things simply. He did not rush into technicalities. He used metaphors that made sense, like, think of your body like a shop that needs a few updates. He was good at making clinical language feel less like a verdict. His pen paused over her charts several times, and each pause felt like an invitation to more questions, but his calm also highlighted Sophie's own jittery edges. At one point, her breathing hitched. The word palpitation stuck on her tongue the way dust might. Her hands went cold. The sound of the antiseptic dispenser clicking open was suddenly a drumbeat in her ears. Sophie's face flooded with heat, and she could feel imagined eyes on the small private panic building behind her ribs. Her cheeks flushed, and she stood up too fast, knocking the clipboard slightly. It slid, a soft slap on the vinyl seat, the paper skittering like a small thing with no right to be in public. She tried to laugh it off, half apology, half embarrassed explanation. "I'm sorry, I can't." "Are you okay?" Daniel asked, and the professional cadence returned, the kind that asked the question before it allowed fear to swell. He stepped back, hands visible, respectful. "Do you need me to step out? We can pause." Sophie wanted to say yes and run at the same time. She wanted to plant both feet and stay and prove she wasn't fragile. Instead, she murmured something about an appointment gone wrong and bolted. The hallway swallowed her. She pushed through the sliding glass doors into the cold air, the city's December breath around her like a reprimand. She walked so fast the chills stung the inside of her nose, and she could feel her pulse in her teeth. Outside, near the clinic's rotating doors, someone had left a string of holiday lights tangled in a bank of discarded umbrellas. The absurd cheer of them hurt. Sophie kept pulling off her gloves with numb fingers, trying to collect herself, to breathe. She felt ridiculous, humiliated. The word childish rode on the back of every self-judge that crowded her head. People glanced up from their phones. A woman with a briefcase looked over with what Sophie swore was pity. She wanted to disappear. She found a bench under a street lamp and sat until her chest unclenched. The city blurred into motion around her. Taxis idling, steam rising from a street grate, the distant clatter of a tram. She called in sick to the bookstore, the excuse clumsy and honest. "I'm not well." The manager's voice was a practiced sort of sympathetic. Then she shut her phone and let the cold noodle itself into her limbs. She felt like she had stepped off a curb into a lower-breathed life and could not find the sidewalk. She had not expected to see him again. That was part of the shame. Suddenly, every person in the city seemed to be keyed to her humiliation. She pictured him returning to some tidy life and shrugging the episode off. She could imagine the scene in her head, Dr. Daniel Hayes, competent, kindly, unaware of the small private spectacle he had witnessed. She wanted anonymity, the safe anonymity of being one among many, unseen and undisturbed.
Instead, 2 days later, in the flaking light of the used book section where she stacked paperbacks and chased stray bookmarks, Sophie felt a presence behind the shelf, the rustle of a coat. She froze, gripping a copy of Middlemarch as if it were a talisman. "Ms. Bennett?" Her voice pealed out like a small bell. "Can I help you find something?" He smiled like he was surprised to be the bearer of good fortune. He did not look like he owned half a city. He looked slightly travel-worn, an image out of context in a clinic white coat, but his coat was clean and the watch at his wrist common silver, not ostentatious.
He talked about a book he'd loved as a child, and then about a title he hadn't been able to find elsewhere. He asked, gently, if she would recommend anything in the romance section, and she found herself pointing, phrases shaping into sentences she hadn't planned. For a few small minutes they stood near the poetry shelf and talked about margins and footnotes. He laughed softly at a joke she made, not ironically, but with a kind that felt like permission to be amusing. It was not the kind of meeting that fit into her tidy anxieties about people higher on some invisible ladder. He bought a paperback, then another. Then he said he was grateful, and he left. He left with a nod like a man who did not expect anything in return. Sophie went home that night, replaying the ordinary kindness. She could have let it sit there. She could have chalked it up to the city being oddly small. But the city was not small. It had a peculiar way of repeating itself, of arranging coincidences until they felt like designs. Not long after, she found herself sitting by the bookstore window, watching December gutters drip, and thinking, with a private embarrassment, that Dr. Daniel Hayes had been kind. A few days after that, in a quiet Sunday morning consumed with overdue bills and leftover coffee, Sophie clicked a headline while trying to find a discount on utility bills. The article opened like a small knife. Dr. Daniel Hayes expands clinic chain. Philanthropy and private investment fuel rapid growth. It was a piece with glossy pictures, Daniel smiling at a ribbon cutting, Daniel speaking at a podium, Daniel alongside a politician in a staged photograph. The byline spoke of venture capital and a medical entrepreneur whose clinic served both insured and low-income patients. The tone was an admiring murmur of progress. Sophie closed the tab. The rational part of her mind tried to argue that the facts didn't change the man who had recommended a paperback, that someone could be both wealthy and kind. But the feeling that came up was older than logic. It had the shape of a long chorus. Money meant other worlds. Money didn't simply mean different. It meant other expectations, other friends, people who'd never had to worry about whether a slow month would mean choosing between an overdue electric bill and groceries. It meant blonde curtains and private schools and dinners she couldn't imagine. She shoved the laptop away and tried to refocus on the stacks that needed reshelving and the litter of receipts behind the counter. But once the idea had taken root, it whispered in every quiet moment. If he had choice, if he had resources that made decisions easy, what would she be? An afterthought? A charity case? The phrase, "not what he's used to," hummed like a neon sign in her head. Daniel, in the meantime, had noticed the change. From his vantage, brief, discreet observation while he waited outside the shop, the way a man who had learned patience measured possibilities, he could tell Sophie had pulled back. She had always been cautious, yes, but now there was a new closeness in the tilt of her shoulder as she shelved books. It was a small, human thing. People carried their difficulties where they could be read, like poorly tied knots. He had spent years learning to read knots. The betrayal that had broken him had left him with a faint, constant ache for normalcy and a sharpened fear of doing harm by misreading tenderness. His last relationship had been a lesson in the corrosive ways money could alter motives. It had ended with a long, complicated silence and a clinking of champagne flutes that had nothing to do with love. He believed now, with that particular flinty certainty, that the less he used his wealth as a bridge, the better. He kept it in a safe box of iron rules. Never buy people out of their lives. Never fix problems you don't understand. And when kindness might be mistaken for leverage, back away. He had a list of professional boundaries as long as his arm. Which is why, when he left a small note for Sophie tucked into a paperback on the shelf, a simple card that said, "I hope this book finds you well," he paused afterward and debated whether it would be better to leave nothing at all. He told himself it was nothing, a courtesy for a woman who had helped him find the comfort of words. That was all. Sophie found the card during a slow afternoon shift. It was the kind of small thing that could have been discarded if she had not been in the habit of seeing meaning in tiny gestures. She unfolded the note. The paper smelled faintly of coffee. "I hope this book finds you well," it said, in a tidy hand. No signature, no title, no implication. A small kindness. For a moment she allowed herself the simple pleasure of being seen. Then the part of her that tallied value against worth, household, rent, the monthly balancing of necessities, reasserted itself. She imagined a man who could buy whatever book he liked, who had staff to remind him of birthdays, who knew nothing of catalog discounts and the way store stock could look at the end of a month. The card made the difference between worlds tangible. She kept the note in her pocket like contraband and picked at the seam of her muffled resentment. If kindness required this cost, she would refuse it. She would be self-sufficient in the way she could. She told herself she refused to be pitied or indulged. She told herself, too, that she would never be the woman who expected rescue. Daniel watched the guardedness like one would watch a delicate vase balanced on a windy windowsill. He wanted to respect it and he wanted to help. Those impulses were not at all as exactly, but they tugged in different directions. His training as a physician had taught him to prioritize well-being, to intervene when necessary.
His training with business had taught him to identify leverage and avoid entanglement. Love had never fit into either type of training. The weeks after the card pulled them into a quiet orbit, he became a presence that was peripheral and not invasive. Sometimes he bought coffee at the cafe across the street and sat reading the same paper until the time she came out on her break. He did not approach her while she was working. He waited until she had a free minute, and then he offered the kind of small talk that does not seek to rearrange a life. He recommended an anthology, returned a jacket someone had left on a chair, paid for a stray customer's coffee when a baby started fussing and a young mother fumbled for change. He was there without dramatics, the kind of steady that could, if allowed, outlast a single bad decision. Sophie caught those glimpses and felt flattered, uncomfortable, suspicious all at once. She told herself he might be lonely, or playful, or curious. She told herself that noticing him as a person instead of a headline was a kindness she could afford. She also told herself to keep a safe distance. On nights when she closed the shop and walked the half-mile to her apartment with a bag of dinner for one and a head full of unpaid notices, Sophie imagined conversations she might have if she were more bravely honest. She could tell him she'd once gone without a dentist for a year because the cost of a repair meant stretching already thin funds. She could tell him the exact hum of her mother's voice when she said, "We do what we have to." But honesty demanded vulnerability, and vulnerability felt like a dangerous trade with someone whose life took place in a different currency. And so the arc of their early acquaintance settled into a rhythm of measured kindness on his side and careful reserve on hers. He gave space, she kept it. In the little hours, Sophie sometimes chastised herself for appreciating the attention at all. She thought about narratives where women like her were props in better-written lives, the poor, grateful recipient of a benefactor's magnanimity. She bristled at the idea of performing gratitude. She worried about being reduced to a story that didn't include the stubborn, capacious parts of herself, her debt to no one for softening edges, her ability to work through fear without needing someone to carry it for her. He, for his part, watched the way she managed aisles and conversations and evenings without theatrics. He observed the small kindnesses she gave to patrons, helping an elderly man find a rare cookbook, recommending a poetry collection to a teenager. He began to respect the economy of her life, the way thrift could be both survival and art. Respect did not, in his view, demand transference into money. It demanded recognition. One Saturday, a child in the store knocked over a stack of Penguin paperbacks, and the burst of falling books turned into an avalanche of laughter and scuffed spines. Sophie dove into the pile with both hands and emerged with a paperback crown on her head and a grin that made the room light differently. Daniel laughed, an involuntary sound, and it warmed something in his chest that had been cool for a long time. He caught himself paying attention to nuances, the way she folded the corner of a page to mark an important sentence, the way she frowned when a line jarred her. He thought of those as small indicators of the way someone loved life, painfully, tenderly, in the margins. There was a night, near the end of a shortened shift, when Sophie walked home under a sky that had begun to whip with early December wind. She felt tired in a way that made her bones feel too loud. She chalked it up to long days, to sleeping poorly, to the emotional toll of feeling exposed to someone who had seen her flinch and still smiled. At her kitchen sink, she stood holding a mug gone cold and felt a soft vertigo, like standing on the edge of a platform and feeling the world move, not because of anything external, but because the inside of her had rearranged. She sat down hard at the little table and put her head in her hands. She expected a cascade of self-reproach, the old script that told her to toughen up, to not take notice of small kindnesses. Instead, a single thought stepped in, quiet and tenacious. If she kept living in constant scarcity of attention,
of confidence. She would never find a way to inhabit a life that allowed more joy. The thought did not come courtesy of anyone. It was an internal nudge, a small domestic revolution. She wanted, more than she wanted privacy or dignity or not being patronized, to feel safe in the presence of another person. That idea felt like transgression. She told herself to be cautious. She dialed her sister and, between murmured details about a broken heater, let out a laugh she hadn't meant to. Her sister's voice was a warm, patient anchor. "You don't have to decide anything tonight, Soph," she said. "You're allowed to be cautious and curious at once." Which was a kinder way to be. Daniel, some distance away in an office she could only imagine from articles and the brief glimpse of his coat, had his own private hesitations. Friendship with a patient, if that word could be used, bristled with ethical warnings he had learned through years of clinical practice. He knew exactly the shape the conversation might take if a relationship were to form while she was still under his care, if any romantic feeling seated itself while he held diagnosis or appointment schedules in his hands. It was a line he would not cross. He would rather step back entirely than risk the complicated power imbalance his role entailed. So he staged his presence more carefully. He learned the coffee shop's opening hours and timed himself to leave before Sophie went in for her break.
He started visiting the neighborhood library and became part of the background, a reader with a reusable cup, a man who nodded to staff and never stayed too long. When they did talk, it was with the kind of quiet decency that kept the world intact. Sophie noticed the difference. It made her both relieved and uneasy. Relieved because the boundaries were intact, uneasy because she now wondered if his absence would last if she allowed for more of herself. She couldn't decide whether she was ready to risk something that might be handed away or withheld. On a night when rain came hard and the bookstore smelled like wet wool and warm paper, Sophie closed up and walked with her hands deep in her pockets to avoid the cold. She felt a flimsy, destabilizing ache in her temple, and almost headache, that she tried to blow away by focusing on the small, controllable task of walking. Everything else felt like it existed in a different register. When she reached the third step of her apartment building, she stopped and leaned against the cool banister, steadying the room around her. The world seemed to tilt slightly, not dramatic, not cinematic, but enough to make her swallow. She could have gone inside, sat with a cup of tea and let the moment pass as fatigue. She did not. She walked instead to the bench outside the cafe across from the bookstore, one she sometimes sat on when closing late, under the shop's sign. She pressed a cold palm to her forehead. The streetlight above painted the shadow of a lacy iron fence across the pavement, and for a moment she felt as if she were being noticed by a city that had no particular interest in her well-being. The bench was wet from the rain, and the cold soaked through her coat. She shivered and felt an odd, flaring panic akin to the one in the clinic, but not the same. It was softer, an internal weather system that felt like exhaustion and something else that suggested her body had been running on too few reserves for too long. She thought of the note in her pocket and the kindness it had contained. She thought with a sudden private fierceness that kindness should not make her small. She pulled the card out and read the line again. "I hope this book finds you well." The irony curled bitterly in her mouth. "You hope I am well, but you don't see the bills stacked on my counter. You hope I am well, and you live in a world where bills are paid by clocks, not hourly shifts." She wanted to be honest. She wanted to reach out and feel the risk of admissions. Instead, her body folded in on itself, and she sat there on the bench, small and shivery, until the cold got too much and she decided to go home. A passerby with an earnest umbrella offered her a ride in a taxi she could not afford. A neighbor from the building saw her and, in the way neighbors do, invited her in to warm up. The neighbor's apartment was full of mismatched blankets and a sleeping cat that hopped onto Sophie's lap and purred like a small engine. Sophie smiled, let the cat knead her palm, and for the first time that week felt a softness she would have once labeled unearned. Meanwhile, Daniel's life moved with the quiet force of someone used to careful arrangements. He oversaw clinics and meetings and investor calls. He listened to pitches that promised to reinvent care delivery. His office was tastefully spare, a single potted plant, a wall of certificates he would only ever look at if he had to prove expertise. That blankness suited him. He liked to keep spaces uncluttered so they could be rebuilt. On a rare evening when the city felt softer, after a meeting that ended earlier than expected, Daniel walked past the bookstore. He hesitated, the way a man who had been taught to think twice hesitated, and then crossed the street. He stood in the doorway and watched Sophie for a moment as she turned the sign to closed and threaded a ladder through a pile of returns.
She glanced his way briefly and then, noticing him, gave a small, guarded nod. He returned it, a non-spectacle like the ripple of an unimportant animal. He could have followed. He could have handed her his number and risked complicating everything. He did none of those things. Instead, he walked over to the cafe and ordered something unremarkable. He sat by the window and read a chapter of a book on his phone, every muscle disciplined to staying in the realm of ordinary patrons. The distance made him want to reach out more. The distance also reminded him of the ethical line. He'd vowed long ago not to cross the clinical boundary into personal pursuit, until and unless there was a clear closing. He told himself, repeatedly, that if any spark of intimacy were to exist between them, it would have to begin without the scaffolding of appointments and charts. He had enough experience to know how messy that entanglement could become. But patience, he had discovered, could be its own kind of courtship. Patient presence that did not demand a return was still a message, "I see you." He hoped that given time and room and mutual consent, what he offered could be seen for what it was, an adult kindness, not a check. He had no illusions that money erased complexity. He saw wealth as a context and never a solution. Sophie noticed the presence without naming it. She alternated between moments of relaxed, accidental conversation and equally quick retreats into reserve. Her mind was a ledger. She recorded small debts, a borrowed book left unpaid, a favor returned, and large fears, being used, being pitied. Her inner voice argued in practicalities. Sometimes it was merciless and had the cadence of a teacher who would not accept excuses. Other times it whispered that she was allowed to be both cautious and curious. The slow burn of their acquaintance moved with gentle friction. A week of small, non-intrusive acts on his part, and a week where she allowed him small windows, an exchange of book recommendations, a chat over a spilled stack of penguins, a shared laugh. The city outside continued to pile on its obligations. A notice slipped under her door one day about a late utility bill, a text from work about an extra shift she could pick up, the eternally slow tick of adult responsibility. Then the weather turned meaner. Streetlights blurred into a wash of halogen, snow beginning to film in soft crystals that made the world look suspended. Sophie, coming in late from a 2-shift weekend, felt the cold dig into her marrow. She walked with her head down, fingers in her pockets, thinking of how to stretch a paycheck. The library shift that afternoon had been harder than usual. Teenagers arguing about music, a spill she had cleaned alone. She felt at the end of the day like paper rubbed thin. She did not know she was running out of reserve. She thought she was managing, but at the intersection near the bakery, her vision went briefly gray. A warmth rose in her cheeks that was not the cold, and her knees gave a little. She tightened her grip on the strap of her bag and leaned against the bakery window, pretending to tie a shoe. Someone asked if she was okay. Sophie's first instinct was to say yes, because saying yes forestalled questions she didn't want to answer. But then a kind-faced bakery clerk, still in an apron dusted with flour, offered her a cup of water and an earnest look, and the pretense fell away. She took the water. The cold inside her slipped. She studied. A small truth rose. Perhaps she had been neglecting things that mattered. That thought was not dramatic. It was not a revelation of plot-level consequence. It was a gentle, dangerous tending toward admitting vulnerability. She kept walking home, the city glittering with holiday lights, and though her legs carried her, Sophie felt a softness under the hardness that had been her armor. She felt, dangerously, irrationally, angry at herself for letting her life careen toward depletion. And she felt something else, a tentative, fragile hope that not everything kind that found her would be a test she had to pass. That night, before she slept, she reread the neat note again and let the line, "I hope this book finds you well," settle in differently. Maybe it was not a patronizing sentence. Maybe it was an offer of goodwill from someone who understood that kindness could be given without strings. Maybe she could be seen and still be competent, could accept kindness without being bought. She did not mean to imagine what kindness looked like in a life lived beside another, but in the small hours, when the city's noise thinned and the radiator hissed like a house settling, Sophie felt the mystery of the possibility and the uncomfortable taste of longing. It was not yet a thing that could be named.
Across town, Daniel ended the day alone in his kitchen with a tray of takeout that tasted like everyone else's. His phone pinged with notifications, clinic updates, a brief message from an old colleague, and then rested. He thought of boundaries and the costs of not crossing them. He thought of her laugh in the bookstore and how it broke something gentle in him that had been guarded. He made a quiet resolution. If anything between them were to be real, it would be honest and free. He would do what was right first,
arrange for care to be transferred if needed, step away from any clinical duty, and only then, with the ethical slate cleared, allow the possibility of more. He did not know yet that life has a way of rearranging around what we try to hold back. Small economies of kindness can become habits that open doors we do not expect. He also did not know the name of the exact small disaster that would test their fragile orbit. He only knew, with the kind of clarity that comes after long disappointment, that when it came to matters of the heart, he would rather be tender than persuasive. He preferred slow, because slow gives space for choice. Sophie, tired and reluctant and somehow kinder to herself than she had been 6 months before, fell asleep with the note folded beneath her pillow like a trivial treasure. She did not realize how quickly the month's thin thread could snap. She did not know that the crossroads of exhaustion and small kindnesses would, in a few days, bring them to a place where polite presence would be insufficient, and truth would have to press through the protective fabric they had both been wrapping themselves in. For now, the city hummed. The bookstore lights blinked off one by one. Somewhere, a snowplow muttered through the street. Sophie dreamed of shelves made taller and invoices paid, of a life where small kindnesses did not feel like debts. Daniel dreamed of boundaries kept and the extraordinary possibility of someone he wanted to know more than as a patient. They moved, separately, toward the point where their lives would ache for authenticity. If this story is touching you, stay with it and like or follow. There's more to come about how two careful people learn to cross the lines that matter, and what happens when the world insists on asking them to choose. When the avalanche of customers slowed and the store fell into the small hush of a winter evening, Sophie thought she might finally be allowed to breathe. She had shelved the last of the returns, stacked the morning's unsold paperbacks into a neat tower, and, with the sort of false optimism that had sustained her through too many months, flipped the closed sign on the door. The walk from the back aisle to the front counter felt longer than usual. Her legs were leaden, a soft trembling under the polite posture of someone who did not want to ask for help.
She started the closing routine, counting the till, jotting the day's notes on a sticky pad, tucking in the last stack of returns, when a hot, sudden tide rose behind her eyes. The lights seemed to thin, like tissue between fingers. A book slid from her hand, thumping softly against the counter. For the length of 3 heartbeats, Sophie told herself she was fine. The world, she insisted, would not rearrange because she was tired. Then her knees gave. Not dramatically, not as in a movie where the camera catches the fall at just the right angle. Rather, she felt the chair she had been reaching for tilt away under a subtle betrayal of strength. Air cut off for a second. The smell of old paper and lemon cleaner tilted into an alien close-up. Someone shouted, maybe a customer, maybe the barista down the street who had come by to see if the shop was closed. Sophie's head descended like something that had finally laid its burden down. She woke in the bright anonymity at emergency bay, the ceiling a pale ocean of tiles and lights. The smell was the antiseptic she had seen in the clinic, but here it was colder, less intimate, full of efficient hands. For a moment her thoughts were a scatter of unpaid bills and an unpaid but somehow urgent need to know whether the stack of returns was right. A nurse's face bent toward her, practical, calm. A monitor beeped like a cautious bird. "Dehydration and exhaustion," someone said. The words landed with an odd lack of drama. "She needs fluids and observation." Sophie heard them like a distant radio, the way a person hears a conversation through a closed door. Her throat felt raw. She tried to speak and the sound it came out was small and apologetic, as if everything she could say had to be offered like a favor. When she saw him, Daniel, she did not at first recognize that she was seeing a man who had been a doctor in her life. He was there because someone, a staff member who knew his name from the clinic perhaps, a volunteer who had mentioned a patient he'd met, had offered to let him know. He hovered outside the curtain like a concerned stranger, his coat flung over one arm, hair mussed as if from an hour spent in the cold. He had not put on his white coat. He had not walked the thin line of professional distance and then decided it was worth skipping. He was, plainly, Daniel Hayes, the man who had recommended a paperback and then a small card, the one whose face had stared out from a glossy article and made the world feel stranger. Sophie felt a flicker of panic at the sight of him, and absurdly the reflex to apologize for being inconvenient. The nurse, gentle, efficient, told Daniel softly that she was stable now and that he could step inside if he was a family member or friend, otherwise the team needed to continue their work. He answered quickly and plainly. He was not here in a medical capacity.
He had come because he'd heard.
He stepped to the foot of her bed, and for the first time since they had exchanged book recommendations, his voice lost the practiced distance he used in clinics. "You scared me," he said. It was not a professional observation. It was something close to a confession. He looked smaller in the artifact light, like someone who had spent too many years wearing a shield and found it heavy on the shoulders. Sophie wanted to be furious with herself for needing help, for being seen in weakness. She wanted to cling to the narrative she'd kept like a talisman, steady, unbought, enough. But the room was quiet in a way that let other things be heard. The soft whir of an IV pump, a chair pushed back, the muffled footsteps of those who carried other people's emergencies through the hall. She felt a human truth press in. Failing sometimes looked like asking for help. "Did they tell you what?" she began, but the words dissolved into a weak laugh. "I'm sorry, I hate being dramatic." Daniel's answer was a small, reckless thing. "You don't have to be dramatic for me to care." He kept his hands in his pockets, careful of boundaries. The sentence was so plain it sounded like a dare, an invitation to accept regard without qualification. Sophie's mouth worked around a reply, and she found herself shaking her head. She wasn't sure yet if she trusted the feeling that had bubbled up to see her in a hospital bed. Hospital hours slid, cushioned by pragmatic talk. A resident explained something about rehydration and rest, and ordered a few more hours' observation. They refused to let her leave fast because the risk of fainting again in the cold and on uneven sidewalks was real. A nurse wrapped a warm blanket around her shoulders and asked about medications and allergies with the flat rhythm of checklists that keep things from unraveling. Daniel sat in the plastic chair near the curtain and watched, the lines at his mouth softening. For a long minute he said nothing, which suited the scene. Small people sometimes need time to articulate what the heart notices. When he did speak, it was not as a doctor. He told Sophie quietly that he had arranged a follow-up, another physician in the clinic who could see her, one not connected to the chain of command but at times felt too close. "It's to keep things clean," he said, "for both our sakes." The word clean felt practical and honest. He explained in the most straightforward terms that he would not be treating her. He would, he said, recuse himself from any clinical role involving her care. He had been given the option to step in, to offer medical direction, but he declined it because he remembered what could happen when money and power and care tangled in the same conversation. He had learned the hard way. Charity can feel like a leash. Sophie, in the afterglow of a restated life support of saline and blankets, met his gaze.
She had expected the opposite. A man who would be tempted to fix things with money or authority, to smooth a life by paying off invisible debts. Instead, he used the language of process and boundaries. It disarmed her in a way that wealth never could have. "Thank you," she said, and the gratitude was not performative. It was a small admission that someone had thought enough to not make her indebted in body or heart. Later, as the hospital shuttled between visiting hours and end-of-day routines, Daniel took his hand from his pocket and unfolded a paper he'd been carrying. On it was a small list, a phone number for the patient liaison who could help Sophie with follow-up appointments, the name of the physician he'd asked to assume care, and a suggestion for a community program that ran wellness classes at the library, the kind of thing that did not cost money but gave structure. He had not made promises of paying bills or erasing all pressures. He had made the more useful offer of time and connection. Sophie imagined him in a boardroom somewhere, used to the sound of negotiations and the clink of things being bought. The sight of him folding a paper list like a talisman felt tender. "You did not have to do any of that," she said. He looked at her, honest and tired. "I didn't think I had to. I wanted to." There was a pause like an intake of breath between them. It was then, while the hospital's mechanical heart kept ticking, that the conversation turned from practical to precarious. Daniel cleared his throat and said something he had not allowed himself to say in the blush of 2 weeks of cautious civility. "Sophie,
I like you. He stopped and searched for words that were not clinical or commodified. I like you, and it's not because I decided to make life easier. It's because when you laugh, I realize how little of myself I let be seen. The confession landed with a rawness that stripped away the last of the neat defenses. Sophie felt exhilaration and terror braid together. The voice inside her that cataloged practical risks spoke up. Hearts could be used for sympathy, for the polish of being generous. But another voice, softer and smaller, added a different ledger. People could also be steady, not theatrical. They could be patient, not imposing. He told her, without bravado, about the last relationship, how he had once believed being generous could melt all anxieties, only to find that some companions loved his power more than his presence. He described champagne toasts that left echoes of hollow promises and a betrayal that had taught him to be wary of how influence could color affection. He did not use these stories to excuse anything. He used them as a map. He had learned where not to step. Sophie listened. And in the listening, she felt something else. His vulnerability was not performative either. It had weight. It gave him edges she could relate to.
She had faults and fears, and a humility that sometimes felt like a fault. Daniel had scars from a life that had once worn him thin. Both of them were, in that light, unfinished. When the doctor assigned to her care arrived at the bedside, a woman with a soft briskness and a clear manner, there was a practical handoff. She explained the plan, the timeline for follow-ups, and the red flags to call about. Daniel stepped back and introduced himself simply as a concerned acquaintance who had been there when someone recognized Sophie in the neighborhood. He left his contact information with the liaison, but reiterated that he would bow out of clinical duties entirely. Sophie later replayed that moment like a small test. She liked his clarity. She liked that his money was, in this case, irrelevant to the work of keeping the line clean. She liked that he had chosen to make boundaries his first gift. After a day of fluids and rest, the doctors discharged her with instructions to rest, to replenish, to be gentle. Sophie felt both embarrassed and relieved to be allowed to go. The hospital corridor felt like an in-between place where decisions were made and then set aside. Daniel walked her to the taxi stand, his breath puffing in the cold air beside her. He did not offer money to pay for the cab. He offered instead to call a friend who lived nearby and could help her with extra shopping if she needed it, a practical kindness, not a headline. Outside the taxi window, her city was faceted with lights, and she watched her reflection split into glass. Inside, she carried the odd, slightly disordered proof that vulnerability could be met with care that did not come wrapped in patronage. She felt, too, the dangerous spark of a possibility she had been taught to regard with suspicion. In the days that followed, the rhythm between them changed. The clinic visit that had begun their acquaintance became a chapter with a full stop. Sophie kept the card Daniel had tucked in the shelf, not as an excuse to be indebted, but as a small, private document of a man who had been present without taking. They saw each other in the neighborhood, but there was a new ease. They met for coffee when they wanted to, not because a schedule obliged them. He learned the train time she used. She learned when his meetings let him breathe. The presence he offered remained steady, like a small light left in a window. Courtship, when it arrived, was not cinematic. It was made of the things intimacy usually is. Errands shared to make the load lighter, a lunch where they traded stories about childhood books, quiet Saturday mornings where they shelved second-hand novels, and argued gently about whether or not one should fold a page to mark a favorite line. Daniel listened to Sophie talk about the small economies of her life, the meticulous way she kept a budget in a row of neatly labeled envelopes, and she, in turn, listened to him talk about clinics and quiet philanthropy and the way he had learned to be suspicious of his own impulses. He never attempted to erase her practical anxieties with a swipe of a credit card. Once, when her heater failed and she shivered with a week's worth of unpaid notices, he helped her find a local program that loaned space heaters to those who needed them. He sat with her on the floor while they filled out a simple application. Another time, he noticed a flyer for a volunteer program at a community library and suggested, not grandly, that they volunteer together, something that offered structure and connection rather than a handout. Sophie found herself laughing more easily. The old ledger that tallied every kindness against a possible price began to fade at the edges. She still guarded herself. She still checked the balance of every exchange,
but the measuring became less about fear and more about fairness. When Daniel apologized for something small, a thoughtless phrase he had not meant to say, she saw that he expected to be corrected. That, more than anything, felt like a promise. They built rituals. Sunday mornings became a small compass, meeting for a pastry at a quiet bakery, then walking to a used book fair where Sophie felt as comfortable as anyone did in a familiar ritual. Daniel would listen to the way she described the margins of a poem as if those margins were a map. He carried her scarf in pockets when she forgot it, and returned lost umbrellas to the cafe with an almost boyish delight. They discovered a charity that ran winter coat drives and, at Daniel's suggestion, spent an afternoon together folding donated jackets rather than giving money. The city, in the weeks that followed, grew colder and then softer with snow. Sophie learned to accept invitations with the slow courage of someone who had only recently decided she might be allowed to be less vigilant at all times. She took a small job helping a neighbor catalog a private collection of children's books for a modest fee, a job that paid in both cash and the warm glow of accomplishment. Daniel admired the way she moved through the world with a self-sufficiency that never felt brittle. He admired, too, that she accepted help when it was offered without drama. They had arguments, as anyone who grows close does. Once they disagreed about a charity event Daniel had supported in the past, where, he admitted, he had blundered by giving money without asking what was actually needed. Sophie was blunt. Money doesn't always know what people need. He listened and agreed, not defensively, and then told a story about a time he learned humility the hard way. The argument closed with both acknowledging they were trying, imperfectly, to be better. Slow burning, steady, a word that kept threading through their days.
Daniel's past hurt often peaked out in moments of abrupt reserve. Sophie would find him withdrawn after a call from an old contact, and she learned to ask the quiet question that could bring him back. "Do you want to talk?" He would let down the coat of armor one piece at a time. She, in turn, had nights when the weight of unpaid bills made speech a labor. He learned to hold space without offering the kind of rescue that erased dignity. Winter folded down toward December's heart. Stores filled with lights, and the city began to move with a different cadence. Daniel surprised her by showing up at a small community recital where Sophie volunteered to read poems to a group of children. He stood in the back, hands shoved into a coat pocket, eyes intentionally not forward, not demanding. Afterward, when the crowd dispersed and the children's coats were handed out to their parents, he walked her home through alleys lit with strings of white lights. Snow feathered the air. At certain angles, the world was all silver. They had known for weeks that this would be a different kind of holiday for both of them. For Sophie, it meant a frayed budget and a small tree bought from a grocery store on sale. For Daniel, it meant the ache of a calendar with too many commitments and the memory of a holiday that had once been hollow. Neither expected fireworks. They expected quiet. On a night when the city's breath hung in the air like soft smoke, Daniel asked if she would meet him for dinner at a small place that made soup like a hymn. He sounded tired, in a way that was not unfortunate. It was real. They ate and talked about the people they loved, about the small, steady things that mattered. A neighbor who returned a borrowed casserole, the exact sentence in a book that had held someone's heart. After dinner, instead of heading to a bar or a party, he suggested a walk. Sophie agreed. They walked past a row of brownstones trimmed with lights. The air smelled of chestnuts and wet pavement. Daniel stopped under a street lamp and took her hands in a way that felt like grounding, not theatrical, just earnest. His eyes were lined with fatigue. His voice found a low, honest pitch. "I'm tired," he said, and it was not a complaint so much as a confession of truth. "I'm tired of pretending I can control everything. I'm tired of being so careful that I never choose anything." He swallowed. "I don't want to be careful with you." Sophie, who had learned to measure words carefully, said, "You don't have to make anything less safe to choose me." He smiled, rueful. "I know. I still have to try." He knelt, not on a knee that demanded theater, but in a gesture that was an unadorned offering. His hand found hers as if to anchor a ship. The snow came down like small, unceremonious applause. He watched her face as if counting small blessings.
Then, after a few long, suspended beats, with a voice that trembled because he had worked so long not to tremble, he said the line that had been in his heart for weeks, both a promise and a plea. "You're all I want this Christmas." Sophie felt the words land inside her like a warm, undeniable object. They were not a challenge or a panacea. They were narrowly, beautifully true. a man tired of pretense offering, in the one way that mattered to him, his unadorned choice. For all the years when she had kept a ledger of what kindness cost, Daniel now offered a new accounting, one in which he did not attempt to erase the texture of her life, but to share it. She thought of the nights of fear and the small acts that had made her feel human in a life defined by margins. She thought of the hospital bed where he had recused himself rather than make her dependent, and she felt in that memory the kind of clarity that shows truth for what it is. She did not imagine a future smoothed of difficulties. She imagined a decision she would make over and over. She let herself nod. "Yes," she said, and the one syllable was the beginning of 1,000 small commitments. She stepped forward and kissed him, not as a surrender, but as a companion's return. The kiss was careful, consented, and enough. They walked home slowly, neither of them in a hurry for the moment to end. The city around them hummed with the kind of ordinary magic that did not need pageantry. Lights in windows, the soft crunch of someone's footsteps, the distant clink of a late streetcar. Friends texted to confirm holiday plans, and both of them, in different ways, felt the safety of arrangements made with care. In the days that followed, they found ways to prove the truth of the choice. Sophie insisted on handling her own finances, and accepted Daniel's help only where it felt mutually agreed. They made plans that were modest, a tree with one string of lights, a pot of soup to share, a neighborhood carol in which they both sang out of tune. Daniel learned the small art of making a life less complicated. He invested time, not money, in gestures that mattered, fixing a leaky faucet in her bathroom with instructions from a neighbor, bringing in groceries when she'd had an exhausting day, staying late at her apartment to help assemble a shelf. They were not perfect negotiators of life. There were nights when Sophie slipped into old anxieties, and nights when Daniel's fear of repeating old mistakes made him overly cautious. But each time a shadow of the past appeared, they met it with conversation and the practice of choosing again. They learned that love was less about rescue and more about constancy, a choice that asked both of them to be honest and brave in small ways, day after day. Christmas came the year soft and silver. They decorated a small tree that fit perfectly on the little table in Sophie's living room. The lights on the tree were warm and not too many.
They wrapped small gifts, books, a scarf he had found in a second-hand shop she liked, a notebook for her lists. They cooked a simple meal together and invited a neighbor who would otherwise have been alone. The evening was quiet and, in its silence, expansive. Later, after their guests had left and snow made the windows look like someone had dusted them with sugar, they sat side by side on the couch. Daniel's hand found hers in the dim light, familiar and exact. The line he had said once that night under the street lamp, "You're all I want this Christmas," now lived in memory, not as a one-line headline, but as daily proof. Sophie rested her head on his shoulder and let the ordinary joy of being known wash over her. He pressed a kiss to her hair, and in the small domestic hush that followed, they both understood the truth the other had spoken, that choosing each other would not be an end, but a series of choices made again and again. She thought, with soft amusement,